Hello, and welcome for another batch of Offensive with me, Hexabu, in Unity of Command 2's Moscow 41 DLC, and specifically the 6 missions of its 3rd conference. And this conference is actually an excellent opportunity to talk about the historical scope of the DLC, because in addition to the highly successful counterattack at Moscow, it covers the Soviet offensives that came right after that, and they don't see as much attention because most of them were tactical successes at best and Verdun-style meat grinders at worst. Moscow 41 is really good at showing us the scope of what really was a half-baked attempt at reverse Barbarossa. You really don't see this period covered extensively in video games, and the holistic view of what was happening on the Soviet-German front back then as offered by the DLC alone makes it special. And the fact that I already mentioned that most of the battles covered in the 3rd conference of Moscow 41 ranged on a scale between just a whoopsie and one of the bloodiest and least conclusive battles of all time, we can expect the corresponding missions to be rather difficult. After all, any kind of success you achieve there is already alternative and almost psychotically optimistic history. And it comes as no surprise that many people have found this DLC to be pretty hard. And don't get me wrong, I did as well, but it feels that many of the people who complain about it have been playing Unity of Command 2 and its possible DLCs virtually on autopilot without getting too deep into the mechanics of the game. And I'm not really disparaging that kind of attitude. Whatever makes you enjoy that game is fine. But the fault, quote-unquote, of Moscow 41 is that it requires you to be an expert or to become one. I myself, someone with almost 500 hours of this game, had to arrange a romantic date with the manual just to understand the way set-piece attacks works, for example, because obviously, there are plenty of fortified Germans out there. So lesson 1 for Moscow 41 is that if you're not prepared to change your approach to strategy and learn a little more about the game you're playing, you might have a hard time enjoying the DLC. The same can be said about your readiness to accept losses. If you can't take feeding your brigades and divisions to the monster of war, this DLC is not for you, and why are you even playing war games? It's not Rambo. Your guys, especially the guys who jump around with an M60 and scream, are supposed to die all the time. You've got orders to follow and objectives to achieve. And if it takes a few funerals, so be it. Alright, now onto some actual advice. Starting with the Luyban mission, you will encounter a new phenomenon. Germans entrenched in cities that have their own source of supply, which you obviously can't just encircle and take by starvation. When I first encountered them, I was going to rail about them, but now having had experience dealing with them, I find them to be a brilliant design decision. On the one hand, you learn the way the Red Army learned. On the other hand, these seemingly randomly plopped supply sources kind of represent the organizational weaknesses of the Red Army still present at the time, preventing it from creating and maintaining very deep breakthroughs and blasting any defenses it has to face. So ultimately, this little feature doesn't force you to suspend the disbelief. It's still a reasonable simulation. And obviously, once you know how to do it, dealing with these obstacles isn't so hard. You use your rather cheap engineers, you use your set-piece attacks, and you use your experienced or guards, infantry or cavalry units. Although I don't particularly enjoy the fact that you can effectively screw yourself over if you don't take the quote-unquote correct abilities for your HQs during conferences, because without set-piece attack, without 3rd level force pool, the DLC can become somewhat unplayable, at least on Classic, and resetting the conference or the entire campaign is never fun. In any case, this is my rant about Moscow 41. I thoroughly enjoy it, and I hope you do too. And now let's look at the missions. Let me just preface this discussion of the Kerch Landing with a little tip that I didn't use here. If you're really struggling, buying a support card prior to it and using it here will help you a lot. Obviously, it will everywhere, but in this specific mission, I found that it just tips the balance. It turns a reasonably difficult mission into an easy one. So anyway, let's get to the objectives themselves, and the first is our very suicidal landing around Kerch. And there are a couple of points you need to keep in mind. Obviously, you need to take Bulganak Bay, and it's worth keeping in mind that it's better to force that unit to retreat rather than killing it. In general, you should avoid combat on turn 1 as much as possible, while taking as many hexes around Kerch as you can, because on turn 2 it will have to fall. I know the deadline is turn 3, but it's way too late. By turn 3, you should already be touching Oisul, or at least be in the hex next to the bridge next to Oisul. But once you succeed both in Kerch and Oisul, just send all of these troops west to support the guys that landed in Feodosia, which is our next point. The Germans will be very quick to set up a rather strong defensive line next to your bridgehead in Feodosia, and you will have to be somewhat aggressive, even if that involves some losses, to get to the bridge just northwest of the city. Preventing the Germans from holding that hex and worse, entrenching there is key to your success in this mission. If there are any German divisions trying to break through east to Oisul, don't stop them. You'll block the railway and they'll run out of supply, and you'll have to deal with fewer defenders later. The army advancing from Kerch will just grind them up for experience. Our final landing is at Sudak, and although the units that land there are pretty strong, they are nowhere near enough to take Karasubazar. Their purpose is to advance towards Stary Krim, to block the supply lines of the defenders near Feodosia, and generally harassing the German and Romanian troops in the area, preventing them from defending where your main thrust is. And your main thrust will be to cross the river north of Stary Krim, and then push your best and fastest units. You will get a tank brigade at one point in the mission through the flats and towards Karasubazar. Your only hope is that the AI will keep shuffling its infantry divisions in that town and will not entrench. In the meantime, set up a supply hub next to the bridge and kick the Germans guarding the other side of the bridge out so that you can comfortably supply the guys advancing towards Karasubazar. Your Kerch divisions should have arrived by this point in force, and leaving a token force to defend the railway in Feodosia, you should push all of them towards Nizhny Hirsky, which is a very difficult objective because of the river and because of the fact that the Germans will fortify that hex. So I highly recommend you to use that paratrooper card you get for capturing Karasubazar to block the railway feeding Nizhny Hirsky so that ultimately the defenders are out of supply and very easy to kill. In my successful playthrough of it, actually the Germans managed to kill that paratrooper brigade and shuffle in an in-supply unit to defend Nizhny Hirsky, but they lost their fortifications, making it very easy to take the town. The Luyban Offensive mission is proof that if you have the horsey, you can do blitzkrieg in swamps. But let's first look at the Leningrad front, the slightly less eventful part of the mission. Your first and immediate objective will be to connect the Leningrad HQ in Volhov with Leningrad proper. This will enable you to remove a supply hub there, and supply problems will be common in the south, and you will also be able to use HQ abilities on the units around Krasnogvardeysk. You can shift some artillery steps to that infantry and breach the German defenses next to Krasnogvardeysk and attempt to encircle it. You'll probably fail to achieve a complete encirclement, but this will distract enemy mobile troops, facilitating your main push in the south. Another thing that Leningrad front should do is help out clearing the bridge near Kirishi. It's a nice additional access point across the river and towards Luyban. Also, to very easy to destroy that elite enemy infantry division with the heavy artillery step holding the bridge just east of Leningrad, just leave a couple of weak infantry divisions right next to it. The AI will be tempted to use that strong infantry unit to attack them, and sure enough, it'll probably destroy all of them, but it'll lose its fortifications and it'll get some suppression, and so next turn you'll just destroy it and connect Leningrad with the Leningrad HQ. Alright, now on to the south, and your critical task here will be to push across the river in the center and take Chudovo. This is the first obstacle of this kind, source of supply plus fortifications plus city, that we'll see in this DLC, and the solution is the same as ever. Experienced infantry, if possible guards, plus engineers and set-piece attacks. Even though Chudovo is not an objective, without taking it, you're gonna suffer significant problems dealing with supply, and even with Chudovo, it's not gonna be too easy to begin with. Now, neither the Bridgehead nor Novgorod objectives are gonna cause you any trouble, except that I recommend you not to rush your attacks on Novgorod, because the Germans will try to counterattack around the Bridgehead, and you might lure the AI into worsening its position in Novgorod, say, once again by attacking some of your troops and losing fortifications for the defenders. Once both of them are yours, push towards Luyban and push across that forest and along that road leading to Luga. The hex next to it, just next to the bridges, is actually one of the best locations for a really big supply hub, and you can actually cross the river there and block the southern route for supply for Luga, while cutting the railway north of it as well. The town itself isn't such an urgent objective, you can actually wait for them to run out of supply, and the cavalry divisions that surround it should go all deep operation and not stop there, just pushing towards Volosova and Kingdisep. I have found that the tanks are slightly better for kicking the Germans out of Luyban, which is usually not too well defended to begin with, as just a plain hex. And if you time the taking of Luyban to the cutting of the railway line north of Luga and the little infantry breakthrough just east of Krasnogvardeysk, you will send the German defenses into complete disarray. And even if they mount a counterattack and maybe protect Krasnogvardeysk, they will not be able to keep their supply lines, and you'll just get both of the western objectives on a silver platter. Expect Demyansk Offensive to be the most frustrating mission of probably this entire DLC because, well, of the heavily fortified objectives with their own supply source thing. Yep, Holm, Demyansk, and worst of all Stara Russa are like that, but first, let's talk about the slightly easier bits in the south, which is where you should be pushing along the railway as hard as you can. Reaching the second bridge on your way there is not only possible, but required. The AIHQ absolutely loves destroying bridges in that area, and if something like that happen on your way towards Toropets, everything is going to be ruined. Why? Because, as you can see, Veliki Luki is not defended at all, and it will stay so until a bit later in the mission. Which means, if you are fast enough, you can take it empty and not worry about anything. The German division that shows up eventually there is pretty chunky, and if it does take Veliki Luki, you're probably going to have a very hard time kicking them out of it. It shouldn't be a problem if you're fast enough, and once Veliki Luki and Toropets are yours, set up a supply hub in the area and push north towards Holm. The northern section of the front here is going to be a lot more painful. Your first and immediate task will be to clear the railway route leading to Stara Russa. Because of the very strict 6-turn deadline that you are under, this is the most difficult objective of this entire mission. And you really want your troops next to it as quickly as possible, and that railway facilitates that. Also, it's worth noting that railway hex next to Stara Russa is an excellent position for another supply hub. If you fail to clear that railway line between Valdai and Stara Russa, you might have to face a well-fortified infantry division in that little place between the two bridges, or potentially blown up bridges, neither of which is great and will spell the failure of your mission. But once the railway is yours, push towards Stara Russa, it is very likely to get another level of fortifications, so as usual, highly experienced infantry with engineer steps used for set-piece attacks is your key to the city. Don't get me wrong here, this objective is rather annoying and it might cause you to restart the mission a bunch of times before you get it right. It sure did for me. But once it's yours, cutting off Salt Sea is going to be very easy, and it's a very easy objective. It's not well defended to begin with, and the troops that have just taken Stara Russa should push southwards to complement your maneuver from Toropets. The approach here is the same: artillery, engineers, set-piece attacks, experienced units. The problem with Holm is that there is a high chance that the enemy HQ will end up in the town and will replenish the defenders' fortifications every turn, meaning that you'll have to breach 2 levels of fortifications in a single turn to get anywhere in Holm. You might fail, but that's how realistically it is. Finally, even though Demyansk is pretty well known for its eponymous pocket, clearing it out very early is not too difficult, but you should gauge how many troops you should devote to it, because it's not a very urgent objective. However, no matter what you do, don't let the enemy set up any defenses in the hexes around Demyansk proper. Because of the supply hub in the town, they'll constantly be able to repair their suppression steps and effectively bar you from ever taking that objective. One thing that you should realize about the Barvenkovo Offensive mission is that you have no objectives east of Barvenkovo proper. So whatever happens in that eastern area should be of secondary importance at best. Also, if you're like me, this is where you realize that you should have given your southwestern or southern front the bridge building capability, which might come very handy in this mission even though you don't really need it. Crossing the river next to Izum with an engineer-equipped infantry division and then attacking Izum, breaching its defenses and then pushing with more forces and ultimately taking Barvenkovo because there's no one standing between you and Barvenkovo anymore is how you do it. But once it's yours, the Germans will do everything to destroy your breach, and they have plenty of mobile troops to do that. The AI will push a lot of troops towards the area around Slavyansk, and for the next few turns it'll be your task to keep them in this mobile, continuously changing and constantly out of supply pockets, meaning that you'll have to exploit that hole in the enemy defenses just east of Slavyansk as those troops mount a second push towards closing it. And speaking of everything that you have in the east, you don't really need that supply hub north of Taganrog. You will have serious supply problems in the west, and the guys who run out of supply in the east can just move to somewhere better. Actually, leaving the eastern bank of the river north of Taganrog undefended might lure a couple of motorized divisions that the Germans have. If it does happen, it's very unlikely that it'll take Taganrog, but at the same time, it'll be one or two motorized divisions less that you'll have to fight around Slavyansk. One final important point about the east is that the railway leading from Kamensk to Voroshilovgrad and elsewhere is your only source of supply. If the AI sees an opening there, it will not hesitate to send a bloody Italian cavalry unit just to block it and screw with your entire mission. Alright, back to the west and the troops you've got at Barvenkovo. Obviously, some of them will have to be left to defend Barvenkovo because the Germans will counterattack them, and to maintain and repair their pockets around Slavyansk. But your best troops, especially cavalry, experienced cavalry units with engineers, should be sent straight towards Zaporozhye. This is the most difficult objective of the entire mission and will probably cause you to restart it a bunch of times. You'll be really short on supply and time there, so make sure you bring your best to Zaporozhye so that you can break through the rather unimpressive looking Romanian division, which is actually very tough. And to help you deal with at least some of the challenges, you should start your push towards Kharkov right off the bat. Because the only railway that connects your supply with Pavlograd and Zaporozhye runs through Kharkov. You don't even need to take the objective. Take the city hex next to it and just clear the railway up to Pavlograd and set up a supply hub next to it. The town of Pavlograd will probably be a bit too difficult to take by the time you'll have to deal with Zaporozhye, but a level 2 supply hub set up right next to that town will be enough to supply the guys attacking Zaporozhye. In any case, once Zaporozhye is yours, Dnipropetrovsk should fall relatively quickly, and you'll be very likely to actually end this mission way before it, well, technically ends, which I urge you not to do. I recommend playing the Barvenkovo Offensive mission before the Orel-Kursk mission, because in my opinion, the latter depends more on the kind of specialists and the quality of troops you bring there, and remember, both the missions have the southwestern front in them. And you already see where I'm going with this. Strip any southwestern troops that you have there of any specialist steps, of any reinforcements, anything that you could use to turn Kursk-Orel operation from a relatively challenging affair into an easy one. The reinforcements and the supply steps that were scavenged in the previous mission will be really helpful in the Kursk-Orel Offensive operation. Once your troops are really well equipped, you shouldn't have too much trouble dealing with this mission, so let's go through its objectives and how to deal with them. The immediate one is Oboyan, and I highly recommend you to try and take it on turn 1, using Katyushas in your infantry and motorized units to soften up that tank division will be very helpful. The objective itself is not that urgent or important, but the bridge next to it is. If you can block it, you'll prevent the tank division just south of it from pushing north and wreaking havoc among your troops. Another turn 1 task in that area is to block the railways around Kursk. They're not well protected and you've got plenty of highly mobile troops there. This will be critical in cutting off the supply in this little Kursk salient that we are about to create. In the north, your immediate objectives will be to push towards the river. If you set up strong artillery next to that tank division and that motorized division, you'll actually be able to destroy them immediately. You also have to block that railway leading from Orel towards Kursk. This'll seal the deal for all of the German defenders in the middle of the map, and just a couple of turns later, without all the Peter they need, they'll be very easy targets. What isn't an easy target is Bolhov. It doesn't look like much, but I think it's the hardest objective of the mission. Thankfully, it's not a town hex, but the infantry inside it is well fortified, and the hex is surrounded by enemy troops. So what you can do is obviously have lots of engineers and artillery handy in your infantry next to the site, and you can lure German divisions out. If you leave the bridge northwest of the objective undefended, one of the German divisions will go and take that hex. It's not going to make a significant dent in your supply situation, but it's likely to clear a hex next to Bolhov, increasing your chances of actually taking it. Crossing the river between Orel and Bolhov will help as well, if anything, with distracting any possible German reinforcements. Orel itself shouldn't be too much of a problem. You have very strong, very experienced Guards troops, some of which are very likely to cross the river south of Orel on turn 2, and it's just not going to be too difficult to kick the defenders out of the town in 2 turns. Because of the supply trap that you can easily set up, the Kursk objective is extremely easy, and so the only one that can cause you any trouble later in mission is Belgorod, because obviously it's a city, it's well fortified, and it's a source of supply. Your immediate concern should be that tank division, and my suggestion is that you shouldn't play loose with it. Don't present it with individual targets, try and encircle it with large forces. Bring in reinforcements before you attack that area, and protect your better troops, which will be your key to taking Belgorod, like that veteran Guards infantry unit with the engineer step. That tank division will inflict losses, and your job will be to manage them. Rzhev is the last, and I think the biggest mission of the DLC, and thankfully, arguably, it's the easiest scenario of the third conference. Granted, it's not going to be a walk in the park, but at this point, you don't have to think about the future, and I urge you to use up all of your remaining cards and drain your entire prestige into the best specialist steps you can get. As usual, engineers are a very good idea, as we will have to face a few well-entrenched enemies, but first, let's look at the horrifyingly distant Vitebsk and wipe our tears, because all of the huge reinforcements we are getting on turn 5 are coming from the north of Vitebsk, and are literally more than enough to take it. Next up in the line of easy-to-get objectives is Yartsevo. That's right, it's not covered by the Germans at all, and you have a couple of power-drop-ready airborne units at the start of the mission. I'm sure you can add 2 and 2 together. Now let's switch our attention towards the most difficult objective of the mission, and somewhat surprisingly, it's Sychovka. You need to take it pretty early in the mission, and the Germans will do everything to protect it. So most of the efforts of the Western Front should be geared towards getting as close to Sychovka as possible, as early as possible. And I can immediately say that advancing from Mazhaisk is a fool's errand. Because of the forests, the Germans will have no problem entrenching themselves there and just blocking your advance. The southwestern route through Yukhnov, supported by a diversionary push from the south towards Vyazma, is the better option because of the easier terrain, and that somewhat menacing German salient around Kaluga and Yukhnov can be relatively easily pierced and split into into a bunch of pockets. It's a very good idea to send your troop just west of Yukhnov and cross the river there. This'll block the railway feeding the salient and ultimately help you finish the encirclement there and bring more units of yours closer to Sychovka. By the way, blocking that railway on turn 1 is a reasonably good task for one of the airborne divisions that you have, though do keep in mind that the effect is not going to last, as the Germans will send a fire brigade and wipe them out. So it might be actually a good idea to drop those paratroopers somewhere near your guys and reinforce them and use them as veteran infantry. In any case, the point of all of these complex movements is getting as close to Sychovka as possible, and if you cross that railway between Vyazma and Mazhaisk on turn 5 or 6, you are doing well. Also, even though you don't have to take it as early as Sychovka, taking Yukhnov gives you a paratrooper division card, which will come in very handy if you find yourself struggling with Sychovka. Other points about Western Front, and specifically Mazhaisk. The Germans will almost certainly send a very powerful attack to take the town. And here you have two options. Either defended, which is what I did in my playthroughs, in which case you need to clear and occupy all of the hexes around Mazhaisk, including that empty hex across the river. Anything short of that will enable the Germans to just brute force their way into the town, regardless of their losses. But at the same time, you can exploit this attitude of the AI by just letting it sustain all these heavy losses and ultimately taking Mazhaisk. You will not be penalized for it, and you will only have to retake it by turn 3. Ultimately, this could mean the Germans overcommitting around Mazhaisk and leaving the other parts of the front without reserves. Also, the AI will take Sukhinichi if given the chance, so keep an eye on that objective as well. Alright, now let's look at the Kalinin front. One thing that you really need to remember here is that anything west of you is absolutely pointless. Just don't go there, don't engage in battles there. No objectives, no expected German counterattacks to talk about, so forget about it. Your main focus here should be on Rzhev and the fortified positions north of it. You've got plenty of time here and extensive use of set-piece attacks and engineers, as well as all of the painful lessons the game has taught you so far about breaking through German fortifications. My only recommendation here is taking the hex just north of Rzhev as quickly as possible, because it will cut the supply line to the Germans in the salient and ultimately make your advance towards Rzhev much easier. And if you do take Rzhev early, which is very possible, push to Sychovka even if it means a German counterattack and a bunch of losses, because that will be a huge distraction that the Western Front will highly appreciate. But once Sychovka is down, Vyazma should not be too much of a problem, because you'll have plenty of highly experienced and well-equipped troops around it. And this is it for today. Barbarossa and then Moscow 41. What's coming next? Could it be file... How do you call it? File... I don't remember. Anyway, subscribe, and like. Bye!